Victory was not a reward for Joseph Stalin, and it was never treated as one. From the moment the war began to turn in the Soviet Union's favor, Stalin used success not to loosen control, but to justify tightening it further. Winning did not soften the system he ruled, it hardened it. By 1943, the war in the East had crossed a decisive threshold. Stalingrad shattered the belief that Germany could not be beaten, and Kursk destroyed the last realistic chance of a renewed German offensive. The Red Army was no longer fighting to survive. It was advancing, and for the first time since 1941, the Kremlin was not reacting to catastrophe hour by hour. That change mattered more to Stalin than any single battle. During the years of retreat and near collapse, fear had been his primary tool. Fear kept people in line, but fear alone is unstable. It works best when disaster feels immediate. Victory offered something far more durable. It allowed repression to be recast as wisdom and absolute authority to be framed as foresight. Control no longer needed to be explained. It could be presented as proven, and that is when Stalin moved. Long before the war ended, the public story of it began to solidify. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official speeches started repeating a simple structure. The party guided the people. Stalin guided the party. The Red Army followed that guidance and prevailed. Individual sacrifice mattered only as evidence of collective obedience. What disappeared from that story were the cracks. The disasters of 1941 did not fit. The disbelief that froze decision-making when Germany invaded did not fit. The purges that left the officer corps crippled on the eve of war did not fit. Victory made it possible to erase those details without debate. The logic was brutally effective. If the system won, then the system must have been right. That logic became the foundation of Stalin's post-war authority, even before the war had finished. As the Red Army advanced westward, Stalin began preparing for a conflict he believed was inevitable. Not against Germany, but against his own population. Millions of soldiers would return home. From Stalin's perspective, that fact was terrifying. These men had seen the system bend under pressure. They had seen orders ignored and lives saved. Many had crossed borders and witnessed societies that functioned differently. Victory had given them confidence, and confidence in Stalin's world was dangerous. Heroes could become rivals. Stalin had built his career on removing threats before they consolidated. The war did not change that instinct. It sharpened it. The very people who delivered victory now posed a risk to the structure that claimed credit for it. So while the Red Army advanced, the machinery of control expanded. Security services did not scale back as conditions improved. They grew. Political officers increased their monitoring. Reports flowed constantly toward Moscow, not just about performance, but about attitudes. The question was no longer who fought well. The question was who thought independently. Victory became a filter. Public messaging reinforced this shift. Success on the battlefield was framed as the result of discipline, unity, and obedience, not adaptation or improvisation. Losses were described as necessary sacrifices rather than consequences of miscalculation. Dissent was redefined as betrayal, not disagreement. The result was a powerful emotional trap. The Soviet population had endured starvation, mass death, and displacement on an unimaginable scale. The desire for meaning ran deep. Stalin supplied it in a single, endlessly repeated idea. We suffered because the enemy was ruthless. We survived because we obeyed. There was no room in that message for alternatives. Inside the military, the effects were immediate. Generals who gained public recognition did not receive security. They received scrutiny. Their correspondence was monitored, their conversations reported, their reputations managed carefully. Victory did not protect them. It placed them under a brighter light. Stalin did not trust popularity. He understood how quickly wartime prestige could translate into influence, and he refused to allow that influence to exist outside party control. Promotions came with political supervision. Praise arrived alongside warnings. Independence, even when effective, became suspect. What nobody was allowed to become was indispensable. This tightening extended beyond the army. Civilians returning from German occupation did not come home as heroes. They came home as questions. Survival itself triggered suspicion. Anyone who lived under enemy control had, by definition, lived outside Stalin's system. That fact alone was enough to demand scrutiny. Filtration camps expanded, designed not to determine guilt, but to measure loyalty. The process was arbitrary, opaque, and terrifying. Innocence offered no protection. Survival did not inspire gratitude, it inspired doubt. Victory did not close the book on suspicion, it formalized it. The broader population, drained by years of war, offered little resistance. Exhaustion breeds compliance, and Stalin understood that better than anyone. He framed continued repression as vigilance, surveillance as protection, and silence as patriotism. The war might be ending, but the language of threat never did. Opposition became indistinguishable from sabotage. At the same time, the official history of the war began to harden. Films, books, and commemorations emphasized clarity and control. Decisions appeared decisive. Strategy appeared coherent. Mistakes faded quietly from view. The war transformed from a lived catastrophe into a controlled narrative. That narrative served a purpose. By tying victory to obedience, Stalin ensured that questioning authority felt like an insult to the dead. The emotional weight of loss became a shield against criticism. Any demand for reform could be dismissed as dangerous recklessness. Any call for openness could be framed as weakening the unity that ensured survival. This approach worked because it felt moral, not political. The Soviet people did not need to be convinced that life was good. They only needed to be convinced that it could have been worse, and that only strict control had prevented that outcome. Against that standard, almost any hardship could be justified. By the time Soviet forces approached Germany, the internal outcome of the war was already decided. There would be no easing of pressure, no opening of debate, no reward proportional to suffering. The victory would be celebrated symbolically, not translated into freedom. Stalin understood that expectation was more dangerous than deprivation. A population that expects improvement might demand it. A population trained to endure will accept almost anything. Victory, framed correctly, reinforced endurance rather than hope. This is the quiet transformation that took place during the war's final years. The Red Army was winning on the battlefield, and Stalin was winning at home. The system that had nearly collapsed in 1941 emerged not weakened, but justified. Fear, discipline, and centralized authority were no longer temporary measures. They were validated by triumph. By the time the guns finally fell silent, the structure was already locked in place. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, but not freer. The war had not loosened Stalin's grip. It had fused his authority to survival itself. From that point forward, opposing Stalin did not just mean opposing the government. It meant opposing victory. And that was a position few could survive. As the Red Army pushed west in 1944, the meaning of victory began to shift inside the Soviet Union. And the shift had nothing to do with celebration. Territory was being reclaimed, cities were being liberated, and the immediate threat to Moscow had receded. Yet inside the Kremlin, a different fear took hold. Stalin was no longer focused on losing the war. He was focused on what victory would unleash. The danger, as he saw it, was not Germany. It was experience. Millions of Soviet citizens were about to return home carrying memories that did not match the official story. Soldiers, officers, medics, engineers, and partisans had lived through chaos, retreat, improvisation, and command failure. Many had survived precisely because rigid orders were ignored at the right moment. Others had crossed borders and seen Europe beyond Soviet control, even briefly. That knowledge could not be unlearned. Stalin understood that confidence grows quickly after survival, and confidence leads to comparison. Comparison leads to questions, and questions lead to alternatives. None of that could be allowed to spread inside a system built on fear and obedience. And that is when control intensified instead of easing. As victory approached, the state security apparatus expanded rather than receded. Surveillance increased, reporting became more granular, and political officers embedded within military units widened their scope. Loyalty was no longer measured by performance alone. It was measured by attitude, tone, and private thought. What mattered most was not how well someone fought. What mattered was how independently they thought. Victory became a test. The official narrative reinforced this shift relentlessly. The suffering of the early war years was reframed as proof that discipline could never weaken again. Losses were described as the unavoidable price of survival rather than the result of catastrophic decisions. The lesson repeated endlessly was simple. Obedience saved the country. Deviation nearly destroyed it. That framing left no room for reform. Inside the officer corps, success began to feel dangerous. Commanders who had earned respect from their troops found that recognition brought scrutiny rather than security. Their mail was monitored. Their conversations were reported. Their loyalty was reassessed constantly. Fame became a liability. Fear replaced gratitude. Even highly decorated officers learned quickly that survival depended on restraint. Promotions came with political supervision. Praise arrived alongside warnings. No one was permitted to appear indispensable except Stalin himself. Victory belonged upward. Responsibility flowed downward. This logic extended far beyond the military. Civilians returning from German occupation did not receive welcome parades. They entered filtration systems designed to evaluate loyalty, not innocence. Survival behind enemy lines was treated as suspicious by default. The assumption was brutal but consistent. Anyone who lived under occupation must have compromised in some way. Victory did not erase suspicion. It institutionalized it. Millions passed through these filtration processes, many without clear charges or explanations. Innocence offered no protection because innocence was never the question. Compliance was. The system was not searching for truth. It was enforcing control. The wider population absorbed the message quickly. Years of hunger, death, and displacement had drained the country's capacity for resistance. Exhaustion breeds acceptance, and Stalin exploited that condition expertly. He framed ongoing repression as vigilance, surveillance as protection, and silence as patriotism. The war might be ending, but the language of threat never faded. Opposition became synonymous with sabotage. At the same time, the story of the war itself began to harden into something unchangeable. Books, films, speeches, and school lessons reinforced a single interpretation. The party led the people. Stalin led the party. Victory followed obedience. Individual suffering existed only to validate collective discipline. There was no space in that story for confusion. Early defeats were blamed on treachery, unpreparedness inherited from the past, or abstract failures of coordination. Tactical improvisation by commanders was minimized. Moments when orders were ignored to save lives were erased. The war became a tale of order, triumphing over chaos. Not chaos survived through adaptation. That version of history served a clear purpose. If the war was won through discipline, then discipline must continue. If survival required obedience, then obedience must remain permanent. Victory became proof that the system worked exactly as designed. This logic proved devastatingly effective. The emotional weight of loss became a political weapon. Questioning authority could be framed as disrespecting the dead. Demanding reform could be dismissed as endangering the unity that saved the country. The past became a moral shield against the future, and the population accepted it. Grief silenced anger. Relief replaced expectation. After years of terror, even harsh stability felt preferable to uncertainty. Stalin did not promise comfort. He promised survival, and that was enough. Inside the party, the same consolidation unfolded. Officials who gained influence during the war were quietly reduced. Committees were reshuffled. Authority was fragmented deliberately. No one was allowed to convert wartime necessity into lasting power. The lesson was reinforced repeatedly. Success came from loyalty, not initiative. Stalin rewarded submission, not competence. This environment ensured that victory did not empower challengers. It empowered the center. Every achievement flowed upward, strengthening the image of Stalin as the indispensable core of the system. Without him, the narrative implied, the country would have collapsed. That story hardened rapidly. By late 1944, the political outcome of the war was already settled. There would be no post-war relaxation, no meaningful opening, no reward proportionate to sacrifice. The suffering would be honored symbolically, not translated into rights or security. Stalin understood that expectation was more dangerous than hardship. A population that expects improvement may demand it. A population trained to endure will accept almost anything. Victory, framed correctly, reinforced endurance rather than hope. This is the deeper paradox of the Soviet experience. The greatest military success in the nation's history became the foundation for deeper control. The war did not break Stalin's system, it refined it. Fear, surveillance, and centralized authority were no longer emergency measures. They were validated by triumph. By the time the Red Army approached Germany's borders, Stalin had already secured his second victory. The first was against the Axis. The second was against the possibility of change. And the second would last far longer. As Soviet forces crossed into Eastern Europe, victory created a new problem that Stalin had anticipated for years. The war was no longer confined to defending Soviet land. It was now exposing Soviet citizens to a world beyond the system that had shaped them. And exposure was something Stalin viewed as a direct threat to control. Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Eastern Germany were not just military objectives. They were windows. Soviet soldiers moved through towns where shops functioned differently, where farms were organized along unfamiliar lines, and where daily life lacked the constant presence of fear that defined Stalin's state. These encounters were brief, uneven, and often violent, but they were enough to leave impressions that could not be erased. That knowledge worried Stalin more than any German counterattack. Experience leads to comparison, comparison leads to doubt, and doubt leads to disobedience. Stalin understood that chain better than anyone in Moscow. Victory had pushed millions of Soviet citizens outside the boundaries of controlled reality, and unless that experience was managed carefully, it could undermine everything the war had supposedly proven. Control followed the army. Political officers and security personnel moved behind advancing units, collecting reports not only on behavior but on attitudes. Conversations were noted, opinions were catalogued, curiosity itself became suspicious. The concern was not open rebellion, it was quiet questioning. And that is where it gets worse. Victory allowed Stalin to justify permanent suspicion. Official messaging insisted that enemies never truly disappeared, they only changed form. Fascists today, spies tomorrow, traitors always. The war was presented as evidence that vigilance must never relax, not even after triumph. This framing gave Stalin enormous leverage. Every hardship endured during the conflict was folded into a single lesson. Survival required discipline. Discipline required obedience. Obedience, therefore, must continue indefinitely. Victory did not signal a turning point, it signaled confirmation. That logic shaped how Stalin treated the very men who had carried the war forward. Returning soldiers were welcomed publicly and questioned privately. Medals were pinned on chests, while files were opened behind closed doors. Time spent outside the Soviet Union was treated as contamination. Exposure to foreign societies, even under combat conditions, marked a person as potentially unreliable. Service did not erase suspicion, it intensified it. Officers faced an even harsher reality. Combat success brought visibility, and visibility brought danger. Commanders who had demonstrated initiative during the war were now viewed as liabilities rather than assets. They had proven that decisions could be made without constant direction, and that knowledge could not be allowed to survive into peace. Stalin did not fear failure. He feared confidence. Promotions came with political supervision. Praise was balanced with surveillance. Independent reputations were trimmed carefully before they could grow into influence. The message was consistent and unmistakable. No one's authority would ever rival the party's, and the party's authority would never rival Stalin's. This logic extended into public memory. Victory celebrations emphasized collective effort under centralized leadership. Individual heroism was permitted only when it could be framed as obedience rewarded. Figures who attracted too much attention were recast, minimized, or quietly removed from prominence. Success flowed upward. Responsibility flowed everywhere else. The story was not allowed to fracture. Textbooks, films, and official histories repeated the same structure. Discipline saved the nation. Leadership ensured survival. Any suggestion that flexibility, improvisation, or dissent played a role was stripped away. The war became a demonstration of order triumphing, not chaos endured. That distinction mattered deeply. If survival came from obedience, then obedience became sacred. If victory resulted from centralized control, then control itself became untouchable. The war was no longer an event to be studied. It was a doctrine to be followed. At the same time, repression became more efficient. Wartime chaos had made mass terror difficult to administer precisely. Victory allowed refinement. Surveillance became targeted. Punishment became selective. Files replaced firing squads in many cases, but the effect remained the same. Behavior was shaped long before resistance could form. The population adapted quickly. Years of trauma had drained any appetite for confrontation. People learned which memories were safe to share, and which ones belonged only to family, if at all. Public speech aligned with official narratives, not because everyone believed them, but because belief was no longer required. Compliance was enough. Stalin understood that fear alone could not sustain a system forever. Meaning had to be attached to it. The war provided that meaning. Suffering became proof of worth. Endurance became virtue. Obedience became honor. Victory fused all three. Inside the party, the same discipline was enforced. Officials who gained authority during the war were reminded that their influence came from Stalin, not from circumstance. Committees were reshuffled, responsibilities diluted, and loyalty tests intensified. No one was allowed to feel secure. Security bred dependence. Dependence bred obedience. By the time Germany's defeat was inevitable, the internal shape of the Soviet state was already fixed. There would be no post-war release, no broad forgiveness, no political reward proportional to sacrifice. The tools forged under pressure were not discarded. They were perfected. The war that began as a fight for survival ended as proof that survival required permanent control. Stalin emerged not weakened by cost, but strengthened by justification. His authority was now tied not just to ideology, but to memory, trauma, and triumph. Germany had been defeated. Change had been defeated as well. By 1945, the war in Europe is effectively decided. Yet Stalin behaves as if the most dangerous phase has only just begun. The Red Army stands deep inside Central and Eastern Europe. Germany is collapsing, and the external threat that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union has been pushed back hundreds of miles. None of that brings relief inside the Kremlin. For Stalin, victory does not signal safety. It signals exposure. Power has expanded outward, and that expansion must now be locked in. Eastern Europe presents Stalin with an opportunity he intends to control completely. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia are no longer just military corridors or buffer zones. They are future political terrain, and Stalin has no intention of allowing uncertainty there. If these regions drift even slightly away from Moscow's influence, they become proof that alternatives to his system can exist under Soviet protection. That outcome is unacceptable. Stalin does not approach the post-war map as a liberator. He approaches it as an engineer. Control must be installed before local authority can stabilize, which meant that political structures arrive alongside tanks, not after them. Security services follow combat units closely, identifying potential opposition before it organizes, while friendly parties are reshaped into tools rather than partners. Coalition politics is not the goal. Dependence is. Local leaders who cooperate are elevated just enough to remain useful, while those who resist are removed quietly and efficiently. Elections are permitted only when outcomes are already determined. Language about liberation fills public statements, but behind the scenes the process is methodical and unforgiving. Victory supplies the justification. Stalin frames Soviet dominance as protection earned through sacrifice. The Red Army bled across Eastern Europe. Therefore, Eastern Europe owes obedience. Any resistance is cast as ingratitude. Any dissent is labeled collaboration with fascism. This moral framing is far more effective than open coercion because it turns opposition into a betrayal of memory rather than a disagreement over policy. Inside the Soviet Union, the same logic hardens. Millions of people are displaced by the war. Prisoners of war return home, civilians emerge from occupation zones, and entire communities are uprooted. In another system, this moment might bring reconciliation. Under Stalin, it brings assessment. Each returning individual is treated not as a survivor, but as a variable that must be categorized. Suspicion does not end with victory. It becomes routine. Former prisoners of war face interrogation, scrutiny, and long-term consequences regardless of circumstance. Time spent in captivity is treated as contamination. The assumption is clear. Exposure equals risk. Survival outside the system demands explanation. This approach is brutal, but internally consistent. Stalin has never believed that loyalty survives without pressure. The war, in his mind, proved that fear must be applied early and continuously, or systems collapse under strain. The lesson he takes from near defeat is not that terror costs lives, but that restraint invites disaster. Victory becomes the final argument against mercy. The broader population, exhausted and grieving, is in no position to resist this consolidation. Years of deprivation have narrowed priorities. Stability matters more than justice. Predictability matters more than reform. Stalin understands that exhaustion produces acceptance more reliably than enthusiasm ever could. So expectation is crushed before it can form. There is no easing of censorship, no meaningful political opening, no promise of a different future. Instead, the language of emergency continues unchanged. Enemies remain everywhere. Vigilance remains mandatory. The war might be over, but danger is never allowed to disappear. This permanent alertness becomes the foundation of post-war rule. Within the party, consolidation accelerates. Officials who gained prominence during the war are quietly reduced in stature. Committees are reorganized. Authority is fragmented deliberately to prevent any one figure from consolidating influence. Loyalty is rewarded. Independence is corrected. Competence alone is never enough. Submission is the requirement. Stalin ensures that no one can convert wartime necessity into lasting authority. Every official understands that their position exists at his discretion. This prevents the emergence of alternative power centers and reinforces the idea that stability flows from the top, not from performance. The result is a state that emerges victorious but rigid. Institutions forged under wartime pressure do not recede. They harden. Surveillance becomes administrative. Fear becomes procedural. Control becomes invisible enough to feel inevitable, but present enough to shape behavior at every level. This is how victory turns into permanence. Stalin understands something many leaders miss. Power is easiest to entrench when people believe it saved them. The war becomes a sacred shield against criticism. Every hardship that follows can be justified as the price of survival. Every restriction can be framed as protection against a return to catastrophe. Catastrophe, Stalin insists, is always one mistake away. By the time Europe begins to divide into opposing camps, the Soviet system is already sealed. The Cold War does not force Stalin into greater control. It gives him a new external threat to justify controls that already exist. Suspicion abroad reinforces repression at home. The war does not exhaust Stalin's authority. It validates it. He emerges from the conflict not as a temporary wartime ruler, but as the embodiment of survival itself. His leadership becomes inseparable from victory, and victory becomes inseparable from obedience. This is the final transformation. A war that began as a desperate fight for existence ends as proof that existence requires total control. Stalin does not loosen his grip because he is convinced, beyond doubt, that loosening it would undo everything the war achieved. Victory in Stalin's hands does not open doors. It closes them. By the time the Soviet Union formally steps out of the war, victory has already done the work Stalin needed it to do. The fighting is ending, but the system created during the conflict is not easing or unwinding. It is settling into place. Emergency rule has quietly become normal rule, and the population is conditioned to accept it without expecting anything different. This is where victory turns into permanent leverage. The memory of the war is shaped deliberately and with discipline. Loss is acknowledged, but only in ways that reinforce obedience. Suffering is honored, but never examined closely. Questions about whether different decisions might have saved lives are excluded entirely. Victory is presented as confirmation that the system functioned exactly as required. That framing leaves no space for accountability. The disasters of 1941, when entire armies collapsed and vast territory was lost, are quietly reshaped. Responsibility slides downward toward unnamed commanders, abstract failures, or enemies within. Stalin's own role during those months grows more authoritative with time, not less. Hesitation vanishes from the record. Paralysis is replaced by certainty. Victory makes that revision permanent. Once Berlin falls, the story hardens. From that point forward, questioning Stalin's wartime leadership becomes more than political disagreement. It becomes an attack on the legitimacy of the state itself. The war is sealed as a completed chapter, and completed chapters are not reopened. This has immediate effects on public life. Historians, journalists, and officials learn where the limits are without needing them explained. Accounts that emphasize confusion, improvisation, or internal disagreement disappear. Narratives that highlight unity, discipline, and centralized authority are promoted instead. The war stops being history and becomes instruction. That instruction serves a purpose beyond pride. It establishes a standard against which all future behavior is judged. The people endured, obeyed, and survived. That sequence is repeated endlessly. Any demand for reform can now be dismissed as unnecessary risk. Any call for openness can be framed as reckless nostalgia. After all, the system won. This logic seeps into daily life. Food shortages, housing crises, and economic hardship are no longer framed as temporary consequences of war. They are presented as acceptable conditions of survival. Complaints are met with reminders of sacrifice. Gratitude replaces expectation. The war becomes a moral weapon. Stalin does not need to claim that life is good. He only needs to insist that it is safer than annihilation. Against that comparison, almost any condition can be justified. Surveillance becomes protection. Repression becomes discipline. Silence becomes loyalty. The population adapts quietly. People learn which memories are safe to share and which must remain private. Stories that contradict the official narrative are kept inside families, if they are spoken at all. Public language aligns with approved versions not because everyone believes them, but because belief is no longer required. Compliance is enough. This quiet accommodation becomes one of Stalin's most enduring achievements. Fear alone cannot sustain a system indefinitely. Meaning must be attached to it. The war supplies that meaning. Suffering becomes proof of worth. Endurance becomes virtue. Obedience becomes honor. Victory fuses those ideas together. Public commemorations reinforce the pattern. Victory celebrations are carefully staged, honoring sacrifice without inviting reflection. The scale of loss is invoked emotionally, but never analytically. The past is meant to be felt, not questioned. This keeps the war politically useful. Inside the party, the same discipline prevails. Officials who survived purges and combat understand that stability depends on preserving the myth. Dissent is dangerous not because it threatens Stalin personally, but because it threatens the story that justifies the entire system. So the system protects the story. Committees enforce conformity. Cultural institutions police memory. Education trains future generations to associate survival with obedience and victory with centralized power. The war ceases to be an event and becomes doctrine. This marks the final stage of consolidation. Stalin no longer needs terror on the scale of the 1930s. The lesson has been absorbed. Control now operates through anticipation rather than constant violence. People know where the boundaries are, even if those boundaries are never stated openly. Victory teaches restraint. The most dangerous outcome of the war is not devastation. It is normalization. Extraordinary control becomes ordinary governance. Emergency measures become permanent policy. The population adjusts to constraint not as sacrifice, but as reality. This is how total control endures. A war that might have shattered Stalin's authority under different conditions instead reinforces it. Survival validates repression. Triumph erases doubt. Memory is shaped so the connection between obedience and existence is never broken. By the late 1940s, the structure is complete. Stalin stands not only as a ruler, but as a symbol of endurance itself. His authority is no longer grounded only in ideology or fear. It is grounded in survival, victory, and the memory of catastrophe narrowly avoided. To oppose him is no longer simply political. It is framed as forgetting what almost destroyed everything. And that framing makes opposition nearly impossible. When the war finally ends, it does not bring release to the Soviet Union. It brings closure of a different kind. By 1945, Stalin has already converted victory into a permanent source of authority, one that requires no renewal and tolerates no challenge. The emergency has ended, but the logic of emergency rule remains in place, preserved carefully and enforced quietly. This is the final form of Stalin's power. The Soviet Union emerges victorious at a staggering cost. Entire regions lie in ruins, millions are dead, and nearly every family carries loss. In many countries, devastation of that scale forces reckoning. Under Stalin, it produces the opposite result. The suffering becomes the reason change is impossible. Too much has been endured to risk uncertainty now. Stability becomes untouchable. Stalin understands that hope is more dangerous than fear in the aftermath of war. Hope invites comparison. Comparison invites questions, and questions invite alternatives. None of those can be allowed to survive. The population must believe that the present order, however harsh, is the only outcome that kept annihilation at bay. Victory locks that belief in place. The central lesson of the war is repeated endlessly. The country survived because it obeyed. It won because it endured. Any weakening of control risks repeating the catastrophe of 1941. The past is no longer memory. It is warning. That message reaches everywhere. Veterans return home with medals, but also with limits. Their stories are welcomed only if they align with the approved version of events. Accounts of chaos, confusion, or disobedience that saved lives are quietly discouraged. Over time, people learn which memories are safe to share and which must remain private. Memory itself becomes regulated. Inside the military, victory does not bring independence. The armed forces remain tightly bound to political authority. No commander is permitted to turn wartime prestige into lasting influence. The lesson Stalin takes from the conflict is absolute. Power must never be shared, even temporarily. This is why investigations and purges do not disappear after 1945. They become quieter, more procedural, and less visible, but they continue. Loyalty is never assumed. It is tested again and again. Fear no longer needs to shout. It operates through files, evaluations, and anticipation. People adjust their behavior long before dissent can form. The state now governs through expectation. Citizens do not need to be threatened constantly. They have learned what happens when lines are crossed. Years of war have trained them to endure, comply, and accept that hardship is permanent. Victory does not promise comfort, it promises survival. That promise is enough. Abroad, Stalin applies the same thinking. Relations with former allies cool rapidly, not because of misunderstanding, but because suspicion is his default position. The war has proven, in his mind, that alliances are temporary and interests endure. Control at home becomes inseparable from caution abroad. The Cold War does not alter Stalin's worldview. It confirms it. Every external tension reinforces the idea that vigilance must never relax. Every disagreement becomes evidence that enemies are always present. The war, though officially over, remains the central reference point for decision-making. It is invoked to justify secrecy, repression, and centralized authority long after the battlefield falls silent. Victory becomes timeless. The war is no longer something that happened. It becomes a permanent condition. Its memory is preserved not to honor the dead, but to discipline the living. Each anniversary reinforces the same lesson. We survived because we obeyed. We must obey to survive again. This is Stalin's most enduring achievement. Defeating Germany mattered, but transforming that defeat into irreversible political control mattered more. By binding his authority to survival itself, Stalin ensures that challenging him feels indistinguishable from inviting catastrophe. The cost of questioning the system appears higher than the cost of enduring it. Fear and gratitude merge into a single emotion. This is the final consolidation of total control. Stalin does not rule through charisma or persuasion. He rules through memory, trauma, and inevitability. The war supplies all three. It provides suffering to point to, victory to claim, and disaster to threaten if obedience weakens. In that environment, freedom becomes synonymous with danger. The Soviet Union enters the post-war world not as a society recovering from conflict, but as a state permanently mobilized by its own history. The fighting has ended, but the war continues as a governing principle. And that is Stalin's lasting victory. Not the fall of Berlin, not the banners raised in ruins, but the conversion of triumph into obedience, and survival into submission. From that moment forward, the question is no longer how Stalin gained total control. The question is how victory made sure he never had to give it back. If you want history that looks past medals, speeches, and victory parades, stay with us. This channel focuses on how power actually worked during the war, how leaders used success to lock in control, and how the aftermath shaped the world that followed. If long-form, research-driven World War II history matters to you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to support this project directly, you can do that on Patreon. Your support helps cover research time, source verification, and the production of episodes at this depth. No exclusive promises and no locked history, just a way to keep this work going.